welcome back to beyoungministry.blogspot.com, to another blog out of the book of Paul written to the Philippians. Welcome to those who access the podcast through the Be Young Ministry YouTube channel. Today we're in Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 through 16, which reads, "Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky, so as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain." That's Philippians 2, verses 14 through 16. As mentioned before, the theme of the book of Philippians is joy, and in every chapter, something unique about the Lord is accentuated. When we put these four uniquenesses about the Lord Jesus together, we have God's definition of joy. In Philippians 1, the life of Christ is accentuated. In Philippians 2, the mind of Christ is accentuated. When His life becomes ours and we yield to His definition of all things, we discover that we are well on our way to having a good working definition of joy, which we are told in Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 10, is our strength. Now, we must be cognizant that everything happens in our lives falls into one of two categories. It's either caused by God or allowed by God. Either way, whatever happens in our lives comes through the will of God for us. And when we are yielded to the very life of Christ being lived in us, and to us, and through us, we discover that He is defining us. So His life is becoming ours. His way of thinking is becoming our way of thinking. So when He is defining us, we begin to think as He thinks. In Philippians 2:14, the Apostle Paul tells us, "Do everything without grumbling or arguing." Grumbling means murmuring, or it's an expression of discontent, an expression of dissatisfaction. And murmuring is muttering in a low voice. It is complaint expressed in a negative attitude. It is an emotional rejection of God's will. That's a bad place to be, because we're fighting Him. As we mentioned before, in every chapter of Philippians, there are potential joy stealers. If we're yielding to the presence of the Lord Jesus and His definition of things is becoming our definition of things, these joy stealers would not be successful in our lives. In Philippians 1, the potential joy stealer is our prisons. Yes, even those things that we had no control over, things that were done to us. Yeah, even those things are potential joy stealers. In chapter 2 of Philippians, the potential joy stealer is people. When Christ's life becomes ours, our prisons become our pulpits. When Christ's mind, or His way of thinking, defines our way of thinking, people become important even when they are being annoying. In verse 14 of our text, the apostle describes conflict that we have in our lives with other people. We lose sight of the fact that God uses others, even when they are being annoyingly wrong, to refine us. This sets off an intellectual debate with God. We end up arguing with God about why people are what they are. God's goal is to use the people, those very same people in our lives, to refine us, to teach us how to love them as God has loved us. Ouch, that hurts. Now, in context, Paul is saying, work out your salvation with the basic attitude that does not grumble or complain and argue. We either feed the Spirit of God, who has awakened our spirit to Him, we call that born again or justified, or we feed the flesh, which are the sinful desires that are still in us even though we've been made alive to God. When we complain and argue, we are feeding the flesh. And quite frankly, it is not smart. It's unwise. It's dumb. You could say it's stupid. And yes, I'm guilty. I see it in my own life and I hate it. According to verse 15, we resist grumbling or arguing so that we may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Now, let me get one thing straight. We are blameless and pure only in the eyes of God through the Lord Jesus Christ. But this is talking about the way the world views us. And yes, when we invite the very presence of God to live out His life out of our lives, and we think His way, we will be perceived by the warped and crooked generation as blameless and pure. He's not speaking here about being made right with God. Paul is ultimately concerned with our witness to the world, and as we allow God to define us, we become billboards of God's way of thinking and living. This, in turn, causes the world to want what we have. The witness in this case is our relationships with one another as believers. And those who are observing us, the warped and crooked generation, will be able to observe how we relate to each other, finding our behavior blameless and our hearts pure. And as we do so, we show the world what the Father is really like. As we learn to love one another and be God's community, we shine among them like stars in the sky. As the light of the world, we show the lost, particularly by the way we love, that there is a better way of being human. Then the people dwelling in darkness will see a great light. As we shine, actually as He shines in our lives and through them, we also hold firmly to the word of life. We are to work out our salvation with fear and trembling because God is watching, according to verse 12. We are to do everything without grumbling and arguing because the world is watching, according to verse 14. Our unity of purpose, created and nurtured by humility, as we considered back in verse 5, and our common love for Christ, which motivates us to stop grumbling and arguing, gives us the ability to offer the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ to the world with credibility. For Paul, when we hold on to and holding out the gospel, it will result in his being able, in the day of Christ, to literally boast that he did not run in vain or labor in vain. The day of Christ is the day when Christ returns to establish His eternal kingdom. In this battle that you and I wage on a day-by-day basis will be over. I look forward to that day. My friends, I trust this podcast is helpful to you in your walk with the Lord. If I can be of further assistance to you, shoot me an email at beyoungministry@gmail.com. Hey, have a great